Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Dragon's Library. So today, we are talking about Deltora Quest. Now, Deltora Quest is a children's fantasy book series written by Emily Rhoda, and it was one of the more interesting books from when I was a kid. So since I'm on vacation at the moment, I went ahead and made this video in advance to talk about it. It's going to be releasing during one of the 2 weeks I'm going to be out. Now, I bet you're wondering, don't you normally do newer releases? Also, why are you talking about some kids' book? Honestly, I was looking for something to review while I was out, saw the 2 hardcover collections on my bookshelf, and remembered it had an anime adaptation that I had never really checked in on. Then I decided to do some more research, and next thing you know, I'm writing the script. So, you're welcome, I guess? I started this channel because I wanted to remember interesting pieces of media, talk about them, and recommend them to people if I liked them. And from that angle, I basically had to talk about this series because no one else I talked to has even heard of it. Now, that might not sound like a big deal. There are plenty of obscure series out there, especially among books. That's the issue, though. By most metrics, this isn't really an obscure series. It's a fairly large franchise. There were a total of 15 mainline books in the Deltora Quest, spanning Deltora Quest 1, 2, and 3. In addition, there were 6 secondary titles like the Monster Guide and Drawing Guide. After that, there were 3 more spin-off series set in the same world but not following the same characters. Then there was a manga adaptation of the first 8 books. Manga are Japanese comic books, for those of you who don't know. And finally, that then got adapted into a 62-episode anime with an English dub. There was also a fun reason why I actually chose to review these things in the first place, and that's because when I first read Deltora Quest as a kid, it was one of the few book series I really enjoyed that didn't have anything to do with dragons. The 3rd book series, Deltora Quest 3, the 4-part one, its whole thing is a waking up 7 legendary dragons, which I found hilarious. Everything I read eventually goes to dragons. There are plenty of series that are at least decently known that don't have this kind of reach. By the way, if you've already heard of the series, let me know in the comments. I really would like to hear from other fans. So, I went ahead and reread the original 8-book series that was like the original release of Deltora Quest, and then I watched the anime adaptation, and to my surprise, the books actually hold up. The anime maybe not so much, but that's another story for another video. That'll happen next week most likely. So let's go over Deltora Quest's original story. Be aware, the other 2 series of 3 and 4 books respectively will be mentioned, perhaps, but I haven't read those and didn't have time to track down some of the copies, so if I made a mistake related to those, sorry. Now, Deltora Quest has a pretty simple premise. Long ago, in the land of Del, an evil entity known as the Shadow Lord, yep, that's actually what he's called, attacked the 7 tribes that called Del their home. Overwhelmed, he nearly conquered the kingdom, until a man named Auden appeared. The blacksmith went to each tribe and persuaded them to hand over a unique relic, a magical gemstone. He then took these 7 gemstones and placed them upon an enchanted belt he had crafted himself. This belt channeled their power to banish the evil from the land of Del, and would continue to protect the land so long as the bloodline of Auden continued to wear it. Unfortunately, the Shadow Lord merely bided his time. Over the years, he was able to infiltrate the royal cabinet and manipulate the royal family into wearing the belt less and less. With the protection gone, to the point where they usually only wore it on Coronation Day, evil spread slowly across Del while the royals lived in blissful ignorance. Eventually, a boy raised as a companion to the prince, Jared, escapes and learns the truth. He tries to warn his friend, but is unable to get back to the palace, and by the time he is brought back, it is too late. The Shadow Lord's servants rip the belt to pieces, and they scatter the belt's gemstones throughout Deltora in fearful places. However, all is not lost, as the king, his wife, and their unborn child manage to escape with the help of Jared, fleeing into the night. Our story takes place over 16 years later. We follow a young boy named Leaf, who is told of the gems and the true story of Deltora's fall on his 16th birthday. His father is Jared, who has reforged the damaged belt over the years so that the gems may be reunited. Wanting the Shadow Lord overthrown, Leaf leaves home to search for the 7 gemstones and is accompanied by Barda, a family friend who trained as a palace guard until his mother was murdered. And they are later joined by the wild forest girl Jasmine. Together, the trio travel across Deltora in search of the lost gems, with each of the first 7 books focusing on one of the gems and its particular guardian. Now, this is a pretty standard fantasy plot. Like, really standard. It sounds like a template for a fantasy book in all honesty. You gotta knock off Sauron, a trio of heroes, a young protagonist, a MacGuffin hunt. However, the thing with Deltora is that it might be one of the best executions of that basic premise I've ever seen, at least when it comes to kids' books. In fact, I would generally describe it as Tolkien, but for kids, which still might be a bit of a stretch, but because I don't remember my other books as a kid being this randomly terrifying on occasion. The series throws around fates worse than death like Game of Thrones, throws around executions. It's a little creepy, actually, just how much pain and suffering it likes to wring out of side characters. Maze of the Beast in particular, Glut is terrifying. Just gonna say that. However, before we go over this, let's talk about the characters. Although they are pretty basic when you go over their basic descriptions. You got Leif, your standard protagonist. His father was Jared, originally planning on the quest, but he suffered a bad leg injury, so now Leif has to take his place. Since Jared was raised in the palace, Leif was brought up with a royal education, even while they were pretending to be a blacksmith family. He doesn't have much practical combat experience, but he is pretty clever and well-read. Next you have Barda. He was a palace guard who left before the Shadow Lord's purge while investigating his mother's death. She had uncovered something about the plot, and since she helped raise Endon and Jared, it was this incident that made Endon contact his old friends. Barda had found them shortly afterwards and helped hide and eventually aid them over the years. He hid as a beggar and used his disguise to gather information on the locations of the gem and on news. Then we have Jasmine. Jasmine is a teenage girl on Leaf's age who grew up in the Forest of Silence, the hiding place of the first gem, the Topaz. She lost her parents to the Grey Guards. These are soldiers of the Shadow Lord. They're a little weird, grown in pods or whatever. She was very young when it happened, but she adopted a crow named Cree and a mouse-like creature named Philly. She also generally talks to animals and is basically like a druidish rogue. She initially tries to rob Leif and Barda, but saves them from a monster when she realizes they aren't Grey Guards. There are also a lot of distinct side characters. There's a lot of them. Some of the most standouts were probably the Merchant, who's basically a version of Dr. Jekyll. There's an amnesiac who leads the resistance called Doom. And then there's the orphan Doom took in, who's called Dane, who constantly wants to prove himself and find his parents. There are a lot of other side characters, and trying to list them all would just get really, really bored really quickly. So let's move on to the next section. So, what makes this series interesting? As I mentioned earlier, a lot of this series has a very generic baseline to it. The reason it's interesting, though, is the execution. Unlike a lot of fantasy, it has a greater focus on characters being clever and smart rather than strong. There are some sword fights, and there is a final battle where the evil Shadow Lord is driven away, but it isn't really swords or some magic fireball or spell that wins, because neither side really has a way to, permanently end this conflict. I guess the Shadow Lord does, but he missed his shot. See, remember when I was describing the plot earlier? How many of you thought something like, the Shadow Lord is an idiot, I would just throw the gems in the ocean, or take them far from the kingdom, or hide them underground? The reason he didn't is because he couldn't. The gems are basically implied to be indestructible, and trying to take them outside of Del's border, or within certain places, like too far down, will likely result in instant death. The Shadow Lord scattered them to prevent their use, but his real goal was to eliminate the royal bloodline and end magic altogether. However, the king and queen escaped with their heir, and it's later revealed in the second series that there are other people descended from Auden. So even if he had been successful, it's possible that there would be other people who could use the belt. And he can't just find them all because, again, it's been centuries and this is like a medieval-style kingdom. So he can't destroy the belt or the gems completely, and Jared managed to get away with it, so he repaired the physical belt, but he was able to scatter the gems. Meanwhile, the belt has powers. Without the air, most of these powers revolve around the mind and healing. The gems can each do some unique stuff. They can help you focus and calm you down, cure you of poison, improve health, give you glimpses of the future, allow you to describe faraway locations, see through illusions, but they're not exactly offensive weapons either. They're pretty harmless individually, and hell, even on the belt, when not in the possession of the air and when everything is not completely correct, they're still mostly harmless. It's only when the belt is used correctly that the Shadow Lord actually needs to fear it. So we just had to make getting to that point as difficult as possible. As a result, this means the challenges tend to present themselves as riddles or mysteries. They're actually a lot of fun, and the book regularly includes visual elements of riddles so that the reader actually has a chance to guess the answer or predict things before the characters do. This is really important because it makes the characters feel clever when they solve something you couldn't, because you were actually given a full chance with all the information they had, so them being able to solve it instead of a kid makes that kid go, oh, that character's really clever. I know that seems basic, but it's amazing how many books do riddles really, really wrong in that respect. I remember being stumped by some of these when I was younger, although as an adult it's a lot easier to figure out solutions, at least the ones I didn't actually just remember while I was reading it. Another thing I thought was interesting was the way that it critiques its own main trope. This series has the core trope of the one true heir. This is the King Arthur trope, essentially. It's a common premise: evils conquer the land, only the last heir of the true king can save it, blah blah blah. There's a chosen method of identifying them, etc., etc. It's a trope that's slowly fallen out of favor for the most part of the last 2 decades. Restoring a monarchy isn't exactly super popular idea, but it still happens occasionally in fantasy. Deltora Quest is one of the first examples I remember reading of something that, like, subverts the trope, at least partially. There is still a true heir, but it's a little more complicated, and I don't want to say anything about it because it's a spoiler when you find out who the heir is or what's going on with them. The inciting incident, however, was the Shadow Lord making the royal family lazy and neglectful of their land, and hiding things eventually behind illusions. And the story does not hold back on that either. When Jared leaves the palace years before the invasion, the city is already in a state of starvation and neglect. A peaceful illusion hides it from the people in the palace, while the advisor, a servant of the Shadow Lord, handles all the communication, but stamps it with the king's seal, which means people think he's hearing their pleas and not doing anything. The Shadow Lord had basically been ruling Del unofficially for years. All the invasion did was make it official. And the royals fell for it hands down. In fact, one of the first things we read about is that the reason the belt isn't worn as often is because one of them got so fat it was uncomfortable to wear. So the advisor at the time, who the advisor's apparently just always been loyal servants of the Shadow Lord, he planted there, said, hey, why don't you take the belt off so that you can, relax a bit. We don't have to wear it all the time, just during formal ceremonies. When you're going to dinner with them, when you're chilling around the house, you don't need to wear it. And then the next ruler, was all like, oh, no, we don't really need to wear that much. Just on coronations and important days. She wore it like 10 times. Literally within 2 generations, it went from, it's always on you at all times because this is maintaining the magical barrier that protects our kingdom, to, yeah, you only need to wear it when you're coronated. It took him 2 generations to get to that point. They were goddamn morons. It's one of the most ingenious parts of his whole plan, making everyone hate the royals. If your only fear is that people might help the king restore the belt and rise to power again, your best play is making everyone not want to do that. And it worked. Leif knew the true story thanks to his father, but most people only know that the king allowed Deltora to fall into ruin long beforehand, and then it was overthrown by the Shadow Lord. There is a resistance, and their leader, Doom, does hate the Shadow Lord a lot, but he actually blames the king and the royals for the land's destruction, because they had literally one job. Like, literally, the reason you're in charge is because you wear the magic belt to keep the kingdom safe. That's the reason you were in a palace. There's a really good line in Book 3 after the trio manages to defeat Sorceress Tegan, who the Shadow Lord around to basically run rampant through an entire region. The party is traveling to this shop, and the shopkeeper is basically talking to Doom. And Doom is, inquisiting about, hey, I heard a rumor that Tegan was defeated. And the shopkeeper is all, oh, news to me. The thorns are as horrid as ever, so I expect that's probably just a rumor. And the party listens as Doom gets, really pissed. And he essentially just says that those weren't Tegan's fault. His exact words were, the thorns are not the result of sorcery, but of 100 years of poverty and neglect. The Del King's thorns, I call them, as do many others. And this isn't the only time it's brought up either. It's a recurring issue that the royal family failed long before the Shadow Lord took full control. That he was basically running the country. I mean, hell, Tegan had cursed the capital of one of the major tribes that helped found the kingdom of Deltora for 100 years before they fell. A century of basically this went by before the Shadow Lord decided to stop playing around the shadows. Jasmine, in particular, regularly has to grapple with this, because unlike Leif and Barda, she's a lot more skeptical of people in general. Barda saw everything firsthand, and Leif trusts his parents, but Jasmine regularly questions why they're risking their lives on a quest while the heir remains safely hidden away. And most of the time she's satisfied with the answer of, hey, we put the belt on him and it gets rid of all this evil stuff. It's like, yeah, but how are we just not going to do this same thing over again in a few centuries? It's a legitimately interesting discussion. I like the characters actually have to grapple with it. Now, there is more I could say on this whole thing, including the various twists along the way about the heir and how they find everything and how the belt works, but this script is already longer than I want it to be, and this is supposed to be a short video, and it's already over 14 minutes long, so Deltora Quest is a great introduction to fantasy for younger readers, and just people who like fantasy I think will probably enjoy it. If you have a kid or just like reading, I would give it a shot. The book holds up surprisingly well after 2 decades, and I think I would give this a solid 9 out of 10. It's not like a perfect series or one of those like iconic things, but it does a very good job of the story it decides to tell. The riddles are nice and fun, and unfortunately the anime adaptation does not hold up that well, but we will be talking about that next week. Hopefully that video comes out. I'm not sure if I'm going to finish it in time, but if not, it'll come out sometime in the next month or so when I eventually get around to finishing it. Just as a reminder, this video and potentially the next ones were prepared in advance, so the next one might be a bit shorter. I'll be back to my normal videos after I get back from my trip, so if you want to know when the next review is, like my normal reviews, that will be back at the beginning of July, and it will be about another Crab's Treasure. It's been a fun Souls-like video game, so look forward to that in the near future. Finally, we have the out card. There is a subscribe orb. Go to my channel, click on it, and subscribe. There's also a video YouTube thinks you might like, so click on that, go check out more things from my channel, and I will see you all next time. Bye!